So welcome and thank you for joining us on our second 2025 Northeast Extension Fruit Consortium Winter Webinar Series. Today we have Dr. Maria Gannett joining us to talk about basic orchard weed ID and management. Maria is an extension educator with us here at UMass on the fruit and vegetable teams. Today, of course, she'll be focusing particularly on orchards.
Thanks, Liz. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for being here, spending your lunch thinking about weeds. As Liz said, I'm the weeds extension educator at the University of Massachusetts, and I'm going to be talking about an integrated weed management program on an orchard. I want to kind of focus a little bit on how to manage rhizotomous perennial weeds because these can often become some of the most difficult weeds in an orchard system. But before we get there, I first want to start talking about species identification because the backbone of any good integrated weed management program is going to be based on the species that you have on your farm. So it's kind of critical that you know the species that you have there and can identify them. Then we'll talk a bit about what an integrated weed management program is and kind of the basics of what a foundational weed management program might be. And then finally, we'll talk about managing rhizotomous perennials specifically and some things to think about there. And the reason I want to talk first about species identification is because you really need to know the traits of your weed species to choose the best management practices. So you're going to have some species, they're going to have different traits, which you won't know unless you know what the species is, and then you can select the management practice. So I want to talk about this kind of not just in theoretical terms. I thought we'd go over a couple different examples. So I'm going to show a couple different weed species. And then underneath each photo are a couple different management options. And I'm just going to talk about the one that I would have chosen for that particular species and why. So does anyone know what this species A is? Feel free to put it in the chat. I'm trying to find the chat. No one wants to guess?
Oh, we've got somebody saying chickweed.
Oh, mullein. Okay. Yes. Okay. We've got a mullein. That is actually going to be B, but species A is in fact a chickweed. There's a couple different types of chickweed. So this is called mouse-ear chickweed, Cerastrium vulgatum. And we know that the leaf structure is pretty similar to what we'd see on a common chickweed with the opposite leaf arrangement. But and then the flower obviously looks very similar to what we'd see in a common chickweed. But these fine hairs that we see on this chickweed species are kind of indicative of it being mouse-ear chickweed. And the important thing is that mouse-ear chickweed is a perennial, where common chickweed is an annual plant. And so if I'm thinking about managing mouse-ear chickweed, I'm going to say that like mowing, flaming, and an application of paraquat are going to manage the above ground growth, but they're not going to do anything to manage the roots. And so a perennial will just be able to regrow. So if I'm going to manage this weed, I'm going to think about tillage as like a more comprehensive way to manage it in the long term. Okay, so then for weed species B, I saw in the chat, we already had someone mention that this was a mullein. This is common mullein or Verbasculum thapsus. And this is actually a biennial. So that means it takes 2 years to complete its life cycle. The first year, it's just going to kind of germinate and hang out as a rosette. It's going to be very low growing. So something like mowing is not going to work to manage it the first year. The second year, it'll send out a flower spike. And as it's flowering, it'll start setting seeds kind of from the bottom up. And then after all the flowers have flowered and set seed, the plant will die. And the only way that it will live until the only way that progeny will survive to the next generation is through the seeds that were set from this 2-year living plant. And so if I'm thinking about tilling for managing this weed. I could potentially till in the fall. I could potentially till in the spring. There are other times as well. But for biennials, generally a late spring tillage can be really useful because you're effectively managing the first year growth as well as the second year growth, plants in the second year of their growth cycle before it's set up any flowers and set any seed. So a spring tillage event can be really useful for biennial species. Okay, I've got 2 more species here. Do people want to guess what C is? Oops, I just gave you the answer. Oh my gosh. Okay, well, lucky you. This is Cercia marvens, or Canada thistle. It's a perennial, rhizotomous perennial species. And you can see that I've already highlighted that I would use stinger to manage this weed. Part of the reason I do that is, again, the paraquat application is to kind of burn down the above ground growth, but not do anything to manage the roots underneath. And then these other 2 weeds, herbicides, don't manage Canada thistle very effectively. So you can take the species and go and look at the labels and see what would be the best option for herbicides as well. And then for D, probably people won't be able to tell the species here, but you should be able to tell me what the family or the genus is. So let's see if I can not tell you the answer and look if anyone's got any guesses. Wait, Liz, I lost the chat. Is anyone guessing correctly? Oh, here we go.
Nobody's guessing on this one.
No
Oh,
one's guessing at
we got a
all.
pigweed. We got a pigweed.
Okay, good. Okay, good. Yes, this is a pigweed. And in fact, this here is redroot pigweed. It's kind of hard to tell just from this photograph that it's redroot pigweed, but one way you can tell that it's redroot pigweed is it's got a little bit of this wavy leaf margin, which is indicative of the redroot pigweed, or Amaranthus retroflexus. And if I'm thinking about managing this weed, this is often found in annual systems. And so people might be thinking about tilling, and then oftentimes they'll till, and sometimes they'll put down their second fertilizer application if they're doing split fertilizer applications. And this weed actually really does very well in high fertility and high disturbance soil environments. So if you're constantly tilling and putting down more fertilizer, you're going to, probably kill the individuals that are there, but you're creating an environment where these species is just going to thrive. And then any seeds that have been set previously or in that soil are going to germinate quickly and continue to grow. So for this weed, I might consider for the long term doing something like adding a mulch, especially one that would have a high carbon to nitrogen ratio, which would actually take some of the nitrogen that's in the soil and kind of immobilize it in the microbial community as it's decomposing that high C to N mulch. And then therefore you're kind of creating a soil environment that's less beneficial to the germination and growth of this particular weed species. So it's not that tillage is necessarily a bad thing in this situation, but in the long term, you're going to think about how is this recruiting that particular species. So hopefully that gave you a bit of put you in the mindset of thinking about, okay, how can we know what species we're dealing with, and then think about how to best manage that particular species. So then you would be motivated to figure out what species you have on your farm, and to figure out what species are there, you generally use what's called a dichotomous key. And that's just a series of questions about the plant that you're looking at. These questions are based on the plant traits that are visible to you. And as you answer the questions, it narrows down the species that it might be. And hopefully at the end, you end up with one species that the dichotomous key has kind of isolated, like this is probably the species you're looking at, or potentially there's a list of a couple different species saying, okay, check these 5. It's probably one of these 5. And then you can go and see which one it is and check if it's what you're looking at kind of in real life. The types of structures that these dichotomous keys will be asking you about are usually defined at the beginning of the key. So if you don't know, the different leaf shapes, or you don't know what leaf arrangement means, or leaf type, don't be worried. The keys will define those because they want people to be able to use the key effectively. And I don't know who the Herbal Academy are, but I just grabbed this image from the internet because I think it does a nice job of kind of illustrating some of those physical characteristics. So we've got a couple different options of leaf shapes, leaf faces, the leaf margins, which is just the edge of the leaf, as well as leaf tips, and then types, and also the leaf arrangement along the stem. Also in this graph or this image, you'll see there's a lot of information about the flower structure and the flower shape. And the reason that is that the flowers are the most conserved structure across evolutionary time on a plant. So they can be really helpful in helping to identify a plant species. Many weed management resources won't focus as much on the flowers because you don't want to wait until your weed has flowered before you start to think about managing it. You really want to identify it as early as possible. But if you do use a plant identification resource that's more focused on, wildflowers, then you might see that it's relying quite heavily on the flowers. And there is a reason for that, but there's also a reason that a lot of weed management resources will focus a little less on the flowers. So there's a couple different places you can find these types of dichotomous keys. I am really partial to this book, Weeds of the Northeast. It has a really nice key that, again, doesn't focus on flowers, and it focuses on weeds that you'll most likely find in this region. If you don't have access to Weeds of the Northeast, but you have another Weeds of a different region book, a lot of the species that we find in the Northeast, we find in other regions as well. So there's no reason not to use another weed identification book if you have access to that. There also are websites that are really available online. I really like this Go Botany Native Plant Trust website because, first of all, it focuses on plants that you'll find in New England. And then it also kind of, as you're answering the questions in its dichotomous key, it's kind of narrowing down the selection of plants that it might be like in real time. So that's kind of fun to watch. And then there are also really helpful apps that you can just download for free on your phone. There's PlantNet, Picture This, iNaturalist. Those are some of the most commonly used ones, but there are other plant identification apps as well. I think sometimes people get worried about an app saying, oh, it might not be particularly accurate, but I'd say that for an app or for a website or for a book, really any of these types of resources that you might use, you might not get the right answer right away. So it's always good to go through, answer the questions, figure out what species you think it is, and then actually double check it. Oftentimes they'll give suggestions in terms of there are some other lookalike plants, and so you can double check to see, is it the one that you think it is, or is it one of the lookalikes? And just kind of confirm that what you think the weed species is actually the weed species that you're looking at. I'm going to say something that is not controversial, but people really wish it were not true, is that grass species are different species. So we've got two grasses here, and they look very similar. The one on the left is different from the one on the right. The one on the left is barnyard grass, Echinocloa crosgali, and this is an annual plant. The one on the right is quackgrass, or Elamus repens, and this is a perennial. So this just highlights the fact that just like broadleaf plants, grass species as well have different traits that are going to make different management practices more or less effective. So you do want to figure out what grass species you have growing in your orchard. When you're thinking about identifying a grass species, you look at slightly different characteristics because the grasses generally look so similar. So the region you want to focus in on most closely is the collar region, which is where the blade of grass intersects with the stem. So at that region, there's going to be a couple different structures that you want to look at. The first one would be the ligule, which is like a membranous sheath that comes up from the blade of grass, but is wrapped around the stem itself. Sometimes that ligule is membranous, sometimes it's hairy, sometimes it's it can be tall or short. It can be a membrane with like a fringe of hairs. It can be absent. So you want to look for that structure first. There are also sometimes these things called auricles, which kind of wrap out from the blade of grass and then again kind of around the stem, but they stick out much more than a ligule would. So these can be like long and claw-like, or they can be short and stubby. Oftentimes they're not there at all, but it helps with identification. The collar region itself can be really prominent, or it can be quite like not prominent and narrow. You also want to look at where the leaf comes out of the buds. That's like within the stem itself. Sometimes that is rolled, and that is a helpful identification characteristics, and sometimes it's folded. You can look at things also like growth habit, so like rhizomes, if there are rhizomes there, or stolons, or perhaps it's like a bunch forming grass, that can help you with identification. And then the blade of grass also helps, but there'll be a few characteristics there, like whether it's hairy or smooth, whether there's a prominent midvein or not, and sometimes the width can help you in relation to the to the length can help you identify the plant. So grass identification is definitely difficult because these things are tricky to see and somewhat subtle. So something like a hand lens can really be helpful in helping you take a look at these different structures. And but it is worthwhile to know at least what type of plant you have, grass you have, so you can tell whether it's an annual or a perennial. Okay, that's kind of what I had for species identification. Do people have questions though before we move on to what an integrated weed management program might look like? I'm happy if you want to come off mute, or you can put something in the chat. I think I can find the chat again. No? Okay. But I'm going to keep going. And we're going to talk a little bit about what an integrated weed management program might look like. When I say integrated weed management, what I'm talking about is using a lot of different types of tools together to help manage the weeds on your farm. Generally, people like to organize these types of tools into cultural weed management tools, physical weed management tools, which can kind of also include mechanical and thermal, and then also chemical weed management tools, which of course would be our herbicides. When you're using all of these together, then you'd have a really integrated weed management program. We're going to start first talking about cultural weed management. And one of the biggest components of cultural weed management, I'd say, is prevention. And when we think about weed management, often we're thinking about chemical or mechanical control, but I'd say that those actually use the most effort, where prevention is actually the easiest way to manage weeds, because if they're not there, then you don't have to do anything. So of course, there's no way we'd ever get rid of mechanical or chemical control, but the more we can think about prevention, I just challenge us, the easier it's going to be in the long run. So try to think a little bit more about prevention, and then hopefully save yourself some time with other weed control tools later. And the best time to think about prevention is during site preparation. When you are thinking about planting a new section of your orchard or a new orchard, definitely spend the time preparing that site ahead of time before planting. You have a lot of tools that are available to you that won't be available after you planted your trees. You can do things like fallow that field, where you go in and you repeatedly till the field multiple times throughout the growing season to manage whatever weeds might be there. You can incorporate cover crops at this time. Those cover crops have benefits for reducing weed pressure by competing directly with those weeds for nutrients and lights and kind of smothering them. But it also can help improve your soil health over time. Depending upon the cover crop species that you might be using, you could incorporate mowing into that management for site preparation, or you can repeatedly mow whatever native vegetation is already there if you don't want a cover crop. You can use things like tarping, which are thick plastic mulches that can be laid out in the field for several weeks to several months, up to a year, depending. And then they do a really good job smothering whatever weeds are underneath that tarp. And you can use herbicides during this time. And this is kind of a special time for two reasons. One, there might be herbicides that are available to you that won't be available after you've planted your crop. And two is that you won't have to worry about crop safety at this time because your crop isn't there. So you can be, you just don't have to be quite as careful with your herbicide applications in terms of crop safety. So definitely spend the first year or two just preparing your site properly. And then once you've spent all that time making sure that you're planting into a site without huge weed issues, then you want to spend the first few years really making sure that your trees get well established. So for years about 1 through 4, you really want to shoot for less than 20% weed cover within the weed-free strips that you've planted your trees into. This will just help get you yields more quickly, and your trees will be well established, and you won't be starting off with a big weed problem. You do want to kind of maintain that weed-free strip. Generally, this is between 2 to 6 feet, so 1 to 3 feet on either side of the tree, depending upon your own personal preferences, your rootstock, the density of your planting. Any plants within this strip, especially in years 1 through 4, will compete with your crop for resources. So that'll be water, nutrients, and light. And they will cause reductions in tree growth and yield. So especially during this establishment period, make sure to maintain this weed-free strip. And then even after, a lot of people ask about living cover within this weed-free strip. And so far, the research I've seen does show that it reduces yields or tree growth. So, if after years 4, you want to allow some living cover in there, that's an option you can make, a decision you can make, but it may still compete slightly with the tree. But any vegetation outside of that strip, or most vegetation outside of that strip, is not going to compete with your crop for resources. So it's actually very beneficial to you to establish a kind of a grassy strip between your rows. It's going to lead to a couple different soil health benefits, including erosion control, improving your traction on your farm, and then increasing water infiltration and drainage. And if you intentionally plant specific species there that are not particularly competitive, then you will thank yourself later because you won't have weed species encroaching from this vegetated strip into your weed-free strip. So kind of think about what species you want to grow there. We're not going to talk too much about this grassy strip for the rest of this talk, but it is an important part of your orchard plan and will help or hurt your weed management going forward. Okay, and then when we're thinking about cultural control, we're thinking a lot about timing of weed management as well. And there's a couple ways we can think about that. First, we've already kind of thought about it in terms of before you plant is a really important time for weed control. We've thought about it in terms of right after you plant for the first few years is a really important time for weed control. We can also think about it within the season. So if we know that every year we want to do some weed control effort, when should we focus that effort? We could ask that question a couple different ways. One way we could ask is like, when can we stop weeding? So if we basically never start, so we just stop weeding right early in the spring, we're going to get a hypothetically pretty low yield. If we go a little bit later into the middle of the season, and then we stop weeding, we're going to get, higher yields, but still not ideal. If we weed all the way, we maintain a weed-free strip all the way through till yield or till harvest, then we're going to get the highest potential yield. It's not really necessarily feasible to maintain a weed-free strip your entire season. So let's say we decide it's okay if we have a 5% yield loss. So then we can stop weeding in July. And this is a bit research has shown this, although some research has shown a little bit earlier, some research has shown a little bit later, but generally about midsummer, we can stop worrying as much about our weed-free strip. This is known as the critical weed-free period. We could kind of also ask this question the opposite way. When should we start weeding? Should we start weeding really early in the spring and then continue on through till harvest, or should we not start until, harvest? If we again kind of go with that 95% yield to 5% yield loss, this research has shown that like kind of May is the time you need to start weeding. So if you combine those two things, that's known as the critical period of weed control. And for apple orchards in the Northeast, this is generally from May through till midsummer. May is kind of more consistently found to be the time you should start weeding, and then it's a little bit on your own orchard when you have to worry about this a little bit less. So that's when you should think about kind of concentrating your efforts. Okay, so we've talked a bit about cultural weed management tools. Now we're going to go on a little bit to physical or some physical, mechanical, or thermal weed control options. I think when people ask me to give a talk about weed management on orchards, they just want me to say, like, this is what you should do, and you won't have any weeds, and it'll be great and very easy and something somewhat prescriptive. But unfortunately, I don't have anything to tell you like that. What I have instead is a little bit more benefits and drawbacks of different tools that you can use, and you're going to have to think about for your own farm, like what you prefer, what you would prefer to use. If I do ever come up with some kind of silver bullet solution, I will let you know, I promise, but I don't have that right now. Sorry. So mechanical cultivation is one way that you can manage weeds in your orchard. This particular method is very helpful for breaking up rhizotomous perennial roots. And it also generally leaves a very bare soil surface. So you have reduced vole habitat. With tillage, you will have a period of time that is weed-free, and then weeds will continue to grow and germinate. If people are having problems with annual weeds on their farm, potentially they're using something like tillage a little bit more than some of other orchards, because this kind of promotes germination of annual species. The problem with tillage is that it can, if you're not careful, your tillage pass can damage tree roots or tree trunks, and also repeated tillage over time can lead to loss in soil quality. Organic mulches are another tool that people can use to help manage weeds on their farm. And these are actually very useful for improving soil organic quality and organic health over time. They improve the soil organic matter content, which are kind of the key indicator for soil health. And it improves soil moisture retention. It can help supply nutrients depending upon, again, that C to N ratio of the organic mulch that you're using, and it helps to insulate the soil as well. So there's a lot of benefits to organic mulches. However, some people have found that they can provide a really good vole habitat. So some people who've tried this, have used this in the past, have seen extra vole damage. You need to have a large supply of your organic material, and that's because you need to have a very thick layer to sufficiently block light from reaching the soil surface so that weed seeds don't germinate. But that mulch material is going to be degraded over time, which is what is improving your soil organic matter. But since it's being degraded, you have to add more regularly. So you need to have a good supply of that source material. Unfortunately, organic mulches don't do anything to stop rhizotomous perennial weeds because those weeds are used to germinating from quite deep within the soil profile. So it won't really be helpful for those. And then if you have a high C to N ratio mulch, so that would be something like bark, sawdust, wood chips, straw, you can immobilize nitrogen. So again, that's as the microbes are breaking down that mulch material, they're using the nitrogen that's in the soil for their own decomposition and growth. And so that nitrogen is kind of tied up in the microbial community and the decomposition of that organic mulch, and it's not available for the trees. So sometimes you have to add additional nitrogen in this type of system. But kind of on the flip side, you can use a much lower C to N ratio mulch. But then you have a little less control over when that nitrogen that would be released from that mulch is available. And sometimes it can reduce apple quality if it's reduced at the wrong time. Living cover, something I've mentioned briefly, it can be really useful for improving, again, soil organic matter, can help suppress diseases, it can provide habitat for beneficial insects and pollinators, and helps prevent erosion because you're having that living cover on the soil all the time. But again, this is another type of material that can provide full habitat. And then so far the research I found, the species that they've looked at, they can compete with crops for nutrients, even when that living cover is mown regularly. Also, some growers don't want to have pollinators present when they're spraying other pesticides, and that can be difficult to do if you're, attracting those pollinators with your living cover. And then again, it won't stop the rhizotomous perennial weeds. Synthetic mulch is another option you can use. It is, I'd say, a little less common, but these synthetic plastic mulches can be very inexpensive, relatively inexpensive. And so when used in a system effectively, they can lead to like a pretty fast return on investment. And some people have found improved tree growth. But they also can increase soil temperature. And so that's in this photo here, you see both someone is trialing black plastic mulch as well as white plastic mulch to try to reduce some of that heat accumulation that you get with the black plastic mulches. You need to figure out how to fertigate if you use black plastic mulch. So then you have to kind of put in an irrigation system. You still need to figure out how to weed within the planting hole. And now you've got kind of a drip tape and fairly delicate plastic mulch that you need to kind of work around. And then, so it doesn't always result in increased tree or fruit yields. So this is an option, but I'd say used a little less frequently because it brings a suite of issues. Still the most commonly used weed management tool would be chemical control. And these, mostly because it's relatively inexpensive for the amount of control of the weeds that you get. Again, you're going to be left with kind of a bare soil surface, so you're not going to be increasing vole habitat. You'll reduce your vole habitat. And if you are targeting rhizotomous perennial weeds, this can be, there are some products that will be helpful for you. However, you also need to be concerned about your crop safety using herbicides, human health effects, including especially for the mixer and the applicator, just making sure that they stay safe, and then off-target effects of the herbicides. Okay. There are other options that are in development that people get excited about, but then usually end up saying, oh, that's not going to work on my farm. But these are in development. So we'll keep an eye on them and continue to talk about them. So hopefully some of these options will be helpful in the future. There are electrical weeders, which used to be kind of a bigger deal. And then once herbicides kind of took over, people stopped really thinking about electrical weeders. They're kind of cool because they've got two different nodes, and then one is above ground and one is underground. And as the weeder moves through, it'll send an electrical current through the weed itself and kind of pop cells as that current moves through the weed, and then it kills the plant that way. There are autonomous tool carriers that people make that are kind of nice because they can go out in the field kind of on their own. You can attach tillage equipment to something like this and have it work in your field on it by itself. There are flame weeders, which can be helpful, although sometimes you risk damaging your tree if you are actually having flames present. There are also steam weeders. These can be useful, but take quite a lot of energy from the tractor and are kind of slow moving to be able to generate enough energy to create the steam that will effectively kill weeds. And then there's see and spray technology, which again can be very useful, but if you don't actually already start with a fairly clean weed-free strip, then you will be essentially just using a regular sprayer in your field, and it won't just be the See and Spray technology. So again, these are in development, maybe not quite ready for many orchards in the Northeast, but hopefully in the future. Oh yes, I see a couple more questions about. Okay, I see a couple more questions. Yeah, we'll look at some of these right now. Okay. Sandra, I'm gonna go back to your question when we talk about rhizotomous perennial weeds. Experimenting with wood chips as mulch, how thick is needed, and has anyone seen scion rooting within the wood chips? Okay, those are great questions, Chuck. A couple inches is generally what people do for blueberries, between 1 and 3. So I assume it would be similar to for apples. Does anyone who uses wood chip mulch want to weigh in at this point to talk about how thick they put the mulch on and if they see any scion rooting within that mulch layer? I'm assuming that's something that would be a problem, but
So the with the mulch, the research that I had seen was 4 to 6 in apples, and the reason why so deep would be to reduce attractiveness to voles. So when it gets thick like that, they just don't like to crawl around under it. And in terms of the scion rooting, the challenge with mulch is that you don't actually want it up against the trunk for a number of different reasons. And so you would keep that basically you'd basically have your mouse guard on your trunk and have the mulch around that, which then of course leaves you with the weeds inside of the mouse guard that you have to deal with. So as with any management practice, there's trade-offs.
okay, yeah, that's great. I didn't know that about the much thicker layer for the apples. That's really interesting and cool for the bowls. Anyone else want to weigh in? Okay. And Jeremy mentioned that they do 2 to 4 inches on blueberries, and they add it every year. So they, kind of agreeing that they need a lot of wood chips to adequately mulch their weed-free strips. Okay, we also, when we're talking about new technology, Jim added that there's lasers which are in development, which is very exciting and true. Laser weed management is a thing, and what it does is it shoots a laser and tries to target not the whole weed, but just the meristem material, so just like where the plant is growing from. And as long as it catches it when it's small, it completely manages those weeds. Pretty exciting. Probably not ready for orchards at the moment, especially orchards in the Northeast, but again, something we should keep track of. And then, do electrical weeders have problems damaging crops? That is another interesting question. There was a talk given out or it was a Zoom presentation, but from a research group out in Oregon about electrical weeders and their effectiveness on perennial weeds. Because that current is, like you're kind of thinking, it's moving through the plant, and so then might be also in the roots. So probably wouldn't damage your crop because they do a pretty good job making sure the above ground node isn't something that someone could just like run into. So you're not going to be hitting your crop accidentally with that above ground node. And it's I haven't listened to the talk from Oregon yet. It was just given, I think, last month. So I don't know if its effectiveness on perennial weeds in general, or perennial species in general, but there's a possibility. But I think even that you wouldn't have to worry about hitting your crop. Okay. So we're going to move on now, talk a little bit about chemical weed control, but I like these questions and we'll have some time at the end again to continue to address them. Okay. So just like other weed control tools, you want to select chemical weed control tools based on the weed species on your particular farm. When we think about chemicals, and which herbicides. We can classify them a couple different ways, which helps me to kind of organize, instead of just looking at a long list of herbicides, organize them, thinking about how they work and what I need to do to get adequate control with the different herbicide products. So one way we can organize herbicides is by when we apply them. We can either apply them pre-emergent, so before weeds have emerged from the soil, or post-emergent, so that's after weeds have emerged from the soil. There's also herbicides can be classified based on location that they work to harm the plant. So there's contact herbicides that just harm the specific parts of the plant that they touch. And then there are systemic herbicides, which land on the plant and then travel through the plant and then work at the site of action, like that's somewhere else. And then there's also how selective the herbicides are. So whether they kill all or harm all plants that they touch, so that would be a non-selective herbicide, or whether they only harm specific species, and so that'd be a selective herbicide. So first, we're going to talk about pre-emergent herbicides. These are the herbicides, you generally apply them to bare soil because they work to kill plants that have not yet emerged. They target the germinating seeds that are within the seed bank, and they need water for two reasons. First, they need water to enter into that zone of germination within the soil profile. They also need water to move from the soil into that germinating seed. So making sure you have adequate moisture within your soil is really important when you apply pre-emergent herbicides. The rate that you apply these is based on your particular soil properties. And that's so you'll have to know your soil's organic matter content and also your soil texture. And then these provide a control for a length of time. This can be usually I'd say at least a month, can provide a little bit more control, can provide a little bit of less. The amount of time that it'll provide control of the weed species germinating within your soil profile depends on on a couple things. It depends on the product, how long it lasts in the soil. It also depends heavily on the microbial community that's living in the soil, because the microbes are going to be what's breaking down that product. And so if that microbial activity is faster, that herbicide will probably break down more quickly, and it'll provide a little less residual control. And microbial community activities based heavily on the organic matter content. And that's why you have to know your organic matter content. You'll apply a higher rate if you have a higher organic matter content. But microbial activity is also based on soil moisture and temperature, which is something that you have no control over, and would vary from year to year. So, you might see or expect a little less residual control if it's a really hot and wet year, and you might expect a little bit longer residual control if it's a drier, cooler year. But of course, you still need that moisture to get the herbicide into that zone of germination. So there's a lot of factors at play when you're applying a pre-emergent herbicide that can really affect their efficacy. When you're thinking about applying a pre-emergent herbicide, you need to know the species that you're trying to manage from the year before you apply this herbicide, because you won't be able to see the weeds that you're trying to manage before you have to apply the herbicide. So say the year before I go out to my farm and I know I really have a problem with barnyard grass, common chickweed, dandelion, goosegrass, horseweed, and prickly lettuce. I'm going to go through my pre-emergent herbicide options and look for one that will control as many of those weeds as possible. So say I look at the labels, and Princep or simazine will effectively control many of those weeds. It'll get barnyard grass, chickweed, goosegrass, and prickly lettuce. I know I still have a problem with dandelion and horseweed. Many people will then tank mix two different pre-emergent herbicides to kind of get a wider spectrum of control. So then I go and I look and I find the norflorazone zone or Solicam label. It has dandelion and horseweed also on the label, and does a pretty good job controlling those. So if I tank mix both of these and apply, then I might get better control than if I just use one. So that's something people often do. You don't have to do it, but it's something you could consider if you know the species that you're targeting and you can't find all of those on one label. There's a couple, I just putting up a couple other common tank mixes, but these will be on the labels themselves of other suggested tank mixes to get a wide spectrum of control. And generally, you can only apply these pre-emergent herbicides once per year. So if you decide you need another application, you'll need to find a different kind of combination to apply later in the season. Generally, we think about applying pre-emergent herbicides in the spring because that's when, like early spring, because that's when plants are just about to germinate and emerge from the soil. But if you actually apply in the fall, there's a lot of benefits for orchard managers in particular. First of all, you are going to have almost guaranteed enough moisture to activate your herbicide. So you'll get any snowfall that happened throughout the winter, and any early season spring rains will help to almost guarantee enough moisture to activate that pre-emergent herbicide. You don't have to worry too much about not providing enough residual control because the soil will be very cool during the winter. So as long as you do like a very late fall application before the soil is frozen, you will have still that like kind of month of residual control in the spring. You'll also be able to better manage your time, because if it's something you've done in the fall, then you don't have to worry about in the spring, and it's something you've kind of already checked off. You're giving yourself like a little extra time before those weeds start to germinate and emerge. So that's just something to consider. Okay. In comparison to pre-emergent herbicides, there are post-emergent herbicides. So these work to kill weeds that have already emerged from the soil. Those can be classified into a couple different, again, types of herbicides. There's the contact, or what we also call burn down herbicides, and those work to harm the plant at this place where they touch the plant. So here you can see someone sprayed paraquat or gamoxone, and you could almost see the droplets of where the herbicide touched the leaves. And I like this picture of this lamb's quarters on the left, because you can see that the boom, you can almost see the boom height, because below the level, like about 1/3 of the way down the plant, you see droplets on the leaves, but above that point, you don't see any droplets. Because these only work where they touch the plant, you really need to make sure to think about getting good coverage on the plant. This is in kind of contrast to systemic herbicides. So both of these pictures here, you can see that the plant was negatively affected by an herbicide, but you can't see where that herbicide landed on the plant leaf. That's because the herbicide actually, lands on the leaf, enters the leaf, and then is translocated through the plant to the site of action. So these ones are both synthetic auxin mimics, and so it's causing this like really crazy growth known as epinasty. Instead of thinking about coverage, of course, you still need to hit all the plants that you're trying to kill, but you need to think more intentionally about making sure that there's adequate time for that herbicide to sit on that leaf and enter into the plant and translocate to the site of action. Okay, and this kind of leads into my discussion of rhizotomous perennials, because when we're thinking about managing rhizotomous perennials, at least chemically, we would do that with generally a post-emergent systemic herbicide. But again, I was just going to stop and check for questions again here, because I'm kind of moving on to another topic. Finally, Sandra, we're getting to your rhizotomous perennials question. Does anyone else have questions? I see one from Nicholas. I overmulch installation via pneumatic blower truck if anyone is interested for orchards. Oh, cool. That sounds really great. So if anyone wants to reach out to Nicholas, they use mulch, and it seems like they've got a cool method for adding additional mulch, which might help with time management and labor. Anything else before I move on to rhizotomous perennials? Okay. Okay, so people might be wondering why I care, why I want to talk about these. I have been at this job for about a year and a couple months. And since I work in extension, of course, the first thing I did was like, okay, I got to survey everyone. That's what we do. We survey growers all the time. And I found out that of the weeds people are managing, Most of them that are the most difficult to manage are rhizotomous perennials. So the 4 most difficult weeds, and here you see I just lumped grasses together, which is exactly what I told you not to do. But 3 of the top most difficult weeds are rhizotomous perennials. So that's why I think they're important to kind of talk about specifically. Just so that we're all on the same page, the rhizotomous perennials are plants that can survive year to year from both seeds and also from root fragments. And then these are unique in that they can also spread via those root fragments. So those roots will grow laterally and kind of spread your infestation of this weed. And this is in contrast to a simple perennial, which also survives from year to year based on roots, on a piece of root or a root, and can sometimes also have a viable seed that helps it to reproduce and spread. But this taproot here is not going of a simple perennial. It might get bigger, it might get deeper, but it's not going to spread laterally. So that's the difference between a rhizotomous perennial and a simple perennial. And the rhizotomous perennials are really the most difficult in an orchard system. And we kind of mentioned this before, but I'm going to mention it again because it's very true. The easiest time to manage creeping perennial or rhizotomous perennial is actually before planting. So if you can plant in a site where there aren't any of these weeds already present, you're going to save yourself so much time. And so site selection is important, although I understand that oftentimes you have no control over where you're going to expand your orchard or plant an orchard. So the next best thing to do is to prepare your site well. If you're going to plant a new orchard, spend the year or 2 or however long you need to manage these rhizotomous perennials before you plant. Again, these are the same tools we've already talked about, but these will be available to you before you plant and won't necessarily be available to you after you plant. Fallowing, cover cropping, mowing, tarping, use of different herbicides or just herbicides with less concern for crop safety. This is the time to take advantage of those. Once you've done a really good job preparing your site, you want to make sure you can keep it weed-free by managing anything that you bring to your farm. One way that people often get propagules of these rhizotomous perennial weeds is through different amendments that they put down on their farm. So sometimes those mulches can carry weed seeds. Here, this is some straw that I spread on a field, and for research, don't worry, I didn't ruin any farmer's field. But here you can see some burdock seed pods that I accidentally included in that mulch. Farm equipment is another way that you can spread weed propagules from site to site, so farm to farm or field to field. When we're harvesting, you really want to be careful about spreading seeds. Seeds can often get lodged in harvest equipment, and then that's how they're spread from field to field. But when we're thinking about rhizotomous perennials, they can also spread via root fragments. And so if you're doing a tillage event and you till and then you're going to move to a new location, make sure to clean off any root fragments that might be stuck on that tillage equipment. Sometimes people accidentally plant contaminated seeds. So whether you're doing cover crops or wildflower strips or even just seeds that you're planting on your farm, make sure they're coming from a source that you know doesn't have any weed seeds contaminating that seed that you're bringing to your farm. And then, of course, a lot of times there's things that are out of your control. So animals can spread seeds. Here we've got a chickadee eating oriental bittersweet seed, and then it's going to come to your orchard. It's going to land on that trellis wire, and it's going to poop out a seed, and now you've got an oriental bittersweet problem in your orchard. So best laid plans, but we understand they don't always, things don't always go according to plan. So the next best time to manage these rhizotomous perennial weeds is when they're seedlings. The earlier you can catch an infestation of these weeds, the easier it'll be to manage them. I really recommend doing something like making a weed map of your farm. This is going to do a couple things. First of all, you're going to be able to track what weeds you have on your farm, whether they're spreading, whether they're shrinking, whether you have them and then you did a good job managing them. But additionally, creating a weed map is just going to force you to sit down and actually identify species that you don't know what they are. Instead of just like in your head classifying that, oh, I have another one of that weed with that funny shaped leaf. You're going to actually know what the species is, and you can look up its trait. And you can see if this is a rhizotomous perennial, maybe I need to get on management as quick as possible. Maybe I don't need to, but maybe I do. Okay, so I was wondering, I think we got plenty of time. So does anyone know what this top left weed is? This is not only species ID, this is weed seedling ID. So this is really tricky. But I wanted, if you know what this weed is, feel free to come on off mute or also just put it in the chat. The top left weed.
Burdock?
Nope, not burdock. It's a good guess. Burdock seedlings are actually really interesting because if you've ever thought about burdock and you lift up the leaf, on the underside, it'll be very shiny. And the seedlings do the exact same thing. Sometimes seedling traits are quite different from like kind of more mature plant traits, but burdock is great because even the seedlings have that really shiny underside of the leaf. So great guess, but not this particular one. Any other brave souls? Okay.
In the chat, we had 2 people take a guess.
Oh, thank you. Yes. Oh, and someone's right. This is Oriental bittersweet. So this is the weed that people had said was the most difficult weed to manage on their farm at the beginning of this presentation. So this is what it looks like, and it's when it's a seedling stage. It will look different when it's germinating from rhizome fragments or root fragments, but this is what it looks like when it's starting to germinate from the seed. So be on the lookout for this, and if you see it, manage it quickly. Great, thank you so much for guessing. Okay, what about the top right? What is this one? This is hard. I see that someone had guessed pigweed before. Oh, yes, and this is bindweed. Oh, wow, this is great. Yes, this is hedge bindweed, Calistegia sepium. So another one that people, especially blueberry growers, seem to be really struggling with here in Massachusetts. Yes, this is hedge bindweed. And I see that also Jim put in morning glory, and it is in the same family as different morning glory species, but this one I like to distinguish, like there's annuals and there's perennials, and then some of the morning glories are annuals. So I like to call those morning glories. And then this one, even though it's in the same family, is a perennial. So generally I call these the bindweeds, but yes, in the same family. What about this bottom left one? I think a lot of people probably know this one. Nutsedge, yes, okay. Allegra, you're killing it. Okay, yes, this is yellow nutsedge. Another one that people really struggle with on farms here. And then, okay, bottom right is tricky. This is a hard one because we didn't really go over, because it's a grass, but we did mention this one earlier. Oh, not crabgrass, no. There's 2 that we mentioned earlier. So if you can think about either of them. Not barnyard grass, so there's another one. This is a good, okay. This one is quackgrass. Yes, quackgrass. Okay, great. So quackgrass is, you can see it a little bit here. Remember I mentioned those auricles, which kind of like reach out and wrap around the stem from the base of the leaf. Quackgrass has these really distinctive auricles that wrap around the stem. And so they're just visible here. It's not the best picture. So I really appreciate you guys for seeing if you can guess, even though I know it's a little bit tricky. But yeah, trying to identify species even at this stage is really hard, but can be very beneficial especially if you're trying to manage these perennial weeds before they become a problem. Thanks, guys. Okay. So say you missed the seedling stage, and now you've got a bit of an infestation of rhizotomous perennial weed. What do you do? I give people the advice that you need to work from the least invaded section towards the most invaded section. And there's going to be 2 reasons for this. First of all, you're going to maximize your uninvaded acreage. you're going to do a better job managing like just a few weeds on the edges here than you will if you just tackle right in the center. So you're going to have more trees that don't have any of that weed there. And then it's also going to give yourself a greater sense of accomplishment. I think for managing these rhizotomous perennials, it takes a little bit of time, and it probably won't be done within one day and certainly, or 1 year, certainly not within one, management event. So being able to kind of show that you're making progress and see that progress, it is very actually beneficial. When we're thinking about managing these plants, we want to think about targeting the roots because that's really where the crux of the problem lies. And you can do that with tillage. Remember when we were talking about tillage as a weed management tool, this does effectively manage rhizotomous perennial weeds. And so here what we've got is a little graph. It's a hypothetical graph of below ground reserves of food that are stored in a rhizotomous perennial root system. So early, in the winter, there's going to be a lot of food reserves stored in that underground root system. And then it's not until the spring the plant will start to send up shoots and have above ground growth. It's going to draw completely on those root reserves to send up those above ground shoots. And so it's going to do a pretty good job depleting some of the food reserves in that root. Then throughout the summer, the above ground growth, it's going to, sustain itself. It doesn't need to draw on any more reserves that are stored within the root system. But it also won't send resources back down into the roots because it's using those resources to flower and set seed and do things like that. It's not until the fall, then the plant will start to send more food reserves back down into the roots, and then the root reserves will continue to increase, and then hopefully it will have enough, hopefully for the plant, it'll have enough reserves to survive another winter and send out new shoots in the spring. So if you want to manage this mechanically, what you need to do is really think about drawing down those reserves through multiple tillage events in the summer. So if you can hit it, and then it'll start to send up new shoots and it'll continue to draw on those underground root reserves. And then once it's drawn down those root reserves a little bit more, you hit it again, and then it's going to do the same thing over and over again. And the idea is that eventually there'll be so few reserves that that root will be winter killed. But I want to give a word of caution. If you only till perhaps once or maybe twice in a year, you could actually just spread your weed further across your field rather than managing it. Since these can propagate from just small fragments of root, anywhere you see kind of these black lines on the root, those are nodes. And so new shoots or new roots can be sent out from those nodes. So if you just till once, you're just going to like spread that plant around your field. It's going to continue to send up new shoots, and you're not going to have managed the problem. You're just potentially going to have made it worse. So if you're going to do this mechanically, just make sure to kind of buckle in and do it multiple times throughout the season. And it might need to be a couple of years of that type of management before you can have adequately killed the infestation. Okay, you can also target rhizotomous perennial weeds using herbicides. And what you are doing is that you're applying the herbicide to the leaves, but you, again, want to think about targeting the roots. And so ideally, you'd use an herbicide that can travel through the phloem. And that's because the phloem has bidirectional flow. So it can go from the roots up to the shoots and also from the leaves back down into the roots. And these are mostly our post-emergent systemic herbicides. As I mentioned before, when we're thinking about applying post-emergent systemic herbicides, you want to give adequate time for that herbicide to be on that plant and enter into the transport system and be translocated to the site of action. So kind of counterintuitively, you need to apply these post-emergent systemic herbicides to healthy and actively growing plants, or weeds in this case, because that's going to lead to the greatest control. If you lead to plants or weeds if you apply them to weeds that are not having a lot of phloem transport, then you're not going to get a lot of translocation to the site of action. Also, if some of these herbicide products suggest adding an adjuvant, and if that's suggested, I would follow the suggestion because you're trying to increase the amount of time for that product to enter the plant. So if it recommends adding a surfactant, that's going to help expand the surface area for that herbicide droplet to enter into the leaf. If it suggests adding a crop oil concentrate, that's going to help reduce the rate of evaporation. And then again, just give more time for that product to enter the leaf. If it suggests using, checking the pH of your spray water or adding a spray conditioner, I would also do that. If you're into biochemistry, you can listen. If you don't like biochemistry, this is just one slide, so don't stress. Here's what happens if you do add a water conditioner. Many of our herbicides are weak acids, and if you add that water conditioner, it's typically suggested that you add ammonium. The cell wall is positively charged, and you want to get it from outside the cell wall into the cell, through the cell wall and into the cell. The ammonium, since it's positively charged, is going to keep that herbicide from ionizing. So it's going to remain in its non-charged form. And because it doesn't have a charge, it's going to be pretty easy to transport across that positively charged cell wall and into the cell itself. Okay, if you don't add that water conditioner, you're going to still have that weak acid herbicide. You're still going to have that positively charged cell wall that you're trying to get through into the cell. But more of that herbicide is going to ionize into like a slightly negatively charged like kind of herbicide active component and positively charged hydrogen ions. And because it has a slight negative charge, it's going to be really hard to transport that across that positively charged cell wall. And so you'll just get less herbicide product actually actively working to kill your weeds. So that's why pH matters. Okay, and then fall is an interesting time. It's when the plants are going to be sending nutrients back down into the roots to store for the winter and survive the winter. So if you were to apply a systemic herbicide at that time, it's kind of like a Trojan horse method where you're going to have a lot of flow through that phloem and it will get into your roots and will do a pretty good job managing that perennial rhizotomous weed. But it's also the time that your plants are sending nutrients down into their roots to survive for the winter. So it's also the most dangerous time to apply a systemic herbicide because if you get any on your plants, you risk killing those as well. So I just mentioned this, potentially if you're trying to manage perennial weeds before you've planted your crop, then the fall is a great time to do it. If you're managing your rhizotomous perennial weeds after you've planted your crop, then fall could be a dangerous time to plant. But you have to think about your own system and how careful you are about applying herbicides and just getting them on the weeds and not your crop. Okay, and then here I promised I'd talk a little bit more about stinker, which is, I believe, on the next slide. But there, I just have a list of a couple of these post-emergent systemic herbicides and some of the tricky rhizotomous weeds that we might think about trying to manage, or I've just included a couple perennials on the next slide as well that aren't rhizotomous necessarily, but some weeds that people might struggle to manage. So the group 1 herbicides are dithoxidin and clethodim that are labeled in apples. They are both systemic post-emergent, and they are very selective just for grasses. I believe this dithoxidin is not labeled in Maine, but if there's growers outside of Maine, I think that is an option for you. And then clethodim as well. They both would do a good job managing quackgrass, although it might take repeated applications depending upon your infestation of that quackgrass to adequately control it. And then halosulfuron methyl is a group 2 herbicide. It can be applied pre-emergent or post-emergent, but it works slightly differently depending upon if you apply it pre-emergent or post-emergent. If you're applying it post-emergent, it works like a systemic herbicide. And if you're targeting yellow nutsedge, this this product could be very useful, but only when applied post-emergent. Typically what the label recommends, if you're using Sandia or halosypyron methyl to target yellow nutsedge, is you apply it when the plants have reached 3 to 5 true leaves. And then once they've reached 3 to 5 true leaves again, then you apply it a second time. So those are options for monocots. And then for some dicots, 2,4-D and clopyralid, that stinger product, are both group 4 herbicides, which again are post-emergent systemic herbicides. 2,4-D is really selective just for broadleaf weeds, but broadleaf plants kind of generally. So it can also be quite dangerous in an orchard if you have to make sure not to get any of this product on your trees. But it does target many different broadleaf weeds, including the Candida thistle. I think some work from Cornell, from Mike Basedow and Janet Van Zoren, who have helped run this seminar series. They found that it was not particularly useful for the bind weeds, but does get many other broadleaves. Clopyralid is another group 4, but is much more selective for particular types of broadleaves. So it really works on plants in the aster family, plants in the Polygonaceae, so that's like our docks, and red sorrel, and as well as plants in the legume family. It's a little less dangerous for applying in your orchard because it generally won't target trees, or anyway, it won't target apple trees. It is a little bit interesting because I spent all that time talking about adjuvants, but on the label for this product, it says not to apply an adjuvant because it already is mixed in a way that should be quite effective. And if you tank mix it with something that does require an adjuvant and you add one, just be aware that it will become a little less selective, and then it will be a little bit more dangerous to apply in your orchard because it won't just work on those asters and the legumes. And then, of course, glyphosate is a group 9 herbicide. It is post-emergent systemic, and it's the only post-emergent systemic herbicide that is non-selective. So it would hypothetically work to kill any plant. However, there are now a lot of plants that are resistant to glyphosate, so it might not work because we've selected for resistant types of different weeds that you use it for, but it's helpful for, again, like things like poison ivy and oriental bittersweet, which not a lot of other products work on. But again, it is also quite dangerous to apply. You have to make sure not to get any on your trees because it could kill the tree as well.